Dear guests, it's a pleasure for me to welcome you to the 5th session of our public lecture series on Europe as an Idea, which is co-organized by Istanbul Şehir University and the Public Diplomacy Office of the Turkish Prime Ministry. Today we have very distinguished guest, Professor Abdelwahab El-Affendi from University of Westminster, London, UK. He's a well-known intellectual and specialized on highly debated controversial topics such as Islam and modernity, Islam and politics, Islam and democracy, multiculturalism, Islam in the West, Muslim intellectuals, and Sudanese and Middle Eastern politics. Abdelwahab El-Affendi is currently a professor of politics at the Center for the Study of Democracy, again in University of Westminster, and coordinator of the Center's Democracy and Islam program. He is the author of many influential books, including Turabi's Revolution, Islam and Power in Sudan, which was published in 1991, Who Needs an Islamic State, again published first in 1991 and 2008. By the way, these two books are available outside, translated by Hasan Kösel Balaban into Turkish as Turabi Devrimi and Nasıl Bir Devlet. You can have it. Other books, Rethinking Islam and Modernity, The Conquest of Muslim Hearts and Minds, Perspectives on US Reform and Public Diplomacy Strategies, and his most recent book about Muhammad, the other Western perspective on the Prophet of Islam, which was published in London in 2010. He was also a member of the core team of authors of the 2004 Arab Human Development Report Towards Freedom in the Arab World, which was a very influential book, report. And is a member of the advisory board and contributor to the 2005 report. He is also co-author of another report titled Contextualizing Islam in Britain, Exploratory Perspectives, which was published in 2009. He also contributed to many leading journals, including International Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, African Affairs, Journal of International Affairs, Encounter, The Muslim World, and others. Dr. El-Affendi is currently a visiting fellow at the Center for Islamic Studies at Cambridge University and has previously been a visiting fellow at the Christian Michelsen Institute in Norway and the International Center for Islamic Thought and Civilization in Kuala Lumpur. After El-Affendi's presentation on secularism, science, and democracy, Hasan Kösel Balaban from Şehir University will share with us his views on El-Affendi's presentation. Focusing particularly on contemporary Turkish foreign policy, Hasan Kösel Balaban is, as you all know, a prominent member of Turkish intellectual life. His discussion will be followed by El-Affendi's response, and then we will have question and answer session at the end of presentations for about 15 minutes. Please allow me to present Professor Abdelwahab El-Affendi. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm really grateful for Şehir University and the Public Diplomacy Office for inviting me and for you for coming to listen to the talks. I always enjoy my visits to Istanbul, which is fast becoming its old self, where it was the capital of the Khilafah. Now, the presentation, I'm going to just present a brief and short part of it. I think there has been, as you probably all know, a very important shift in relationship between Islam and the West, or Europe and the rest of the Muslim world, since 9/11. And what I'm going to focus on here is just one aspect which the debate about this has taken, and which reflects on the present situation. Since 9/11, there has been a debate which is still going on about whether the events or the so-called Islamic terrorism is caused by political reasons or by religious reasons. And while a majority of academics and intellectuals wanted to see the complex picture and see it as to do with US foreign policy, with grievances certain groups have, there was a small group who insisted that it has to do with religious fanaticism, but there was even another group which said it has to do with Islam as such, that the problem is a problem of Islam. And this group, this line of thinking, had agreed with some so-called new conservatives and some old people from the old Orientalist school. And there are some people who are actually members of all these groups together. For example, Kramer, who was a prominent Israeli intellectual from the Moshe Dayan Center, is a new conservative. He's also an Orientalist, and he is one of the main, with Daniel Pipes, he's one of the main proponents of the issue that it is Islam and religion, alternatively Islamism or Islam, which is the problem. And of course, we had the famous clash of civilization theses. And there are a counter argument by people like Aran Konundani, who call this, because there was a famous article by Bernard Lewis about the roots of the Muslim rage, which actually preceded 9/11 by 11 years. But Konundani called this the liberal rage against Islam. And it has many reasons, because there has been in Europe, and particularly in Britain, certain controversies. The Salman Rushdie affair of satanic verses in 1989, which started at the same time at the headscarf debate in France. So there were some interactions with the Muslim communities in Europe, and some conflicts. These conflicts has led some of the liberals to actually join the conservative. Before that, before these events, usually it was the right wing who were anti-Muslim, while the left and the liberals usually were pro-Muslim because they were pro-immigrant. But starting from the Rushdie affair, we found that a number of liberals, people from the left, started also to attack Muslims. Then when 9/11 came, even more liberals started to see Muslims, especially Muslim immigration, into the West as a problem. Now, at a later stage, we had people from the liberal left who actually took the argument further, saying that the problem is not just Islam, it's religion as such. All religion is wrong. And I'm taking one example of this trend. A person called Richard Dawkins, professor, actually he's now Professor Emeritus because he retired. Richard Dawkins is a biologist. He's not actually an expert on Islam or religion or anything. He was famous for his book, the Selfish Gene, which was about evolution. But he started to argue that because there was always opposition between the evolutionists and the so-called creationists, in particular in America. And so he started from the argument that 9/11 is a problem of Islam to the question that we have a problem of religion as such. And according to Dawkins, he's very popular. His book called the God Delusion actually sold about 2 million copies. I must admit that one of these copies I bought, which didn't help me much, but especially not even in my current presentation. But what is significant about Dawkins, and there's a group around him called the New Atheists. One of them is the late Christopher Hitchens and another guy named Sam Harris. That they have taken this argument further. Usually they start from Islam. They say Islam is a problem. We have a problem called Islam. But this problem is also a problem of religion. It's also with Judaism, with Christianity. And we have to get rid of religion, and this would solve the problem. Dawkins' thesis in a nutshell is that there is a contrast between religion and science. Science is based on evidence. It's a discipline of investigation based on constructive doubt, and it employs logic, evidence, and reason to draw conclusions. It presents hypotheses which can be falsifiable, while religion, by contrast, demands positive suspension of critical faculties and seeks to turn untested beliefs into unshakable truth. It's also harmful because it breeds intolerance and a warped, inflexible morality, and this also leads to violence. Now, Dawkins, of course, has been criticized by many people, but what I'm going to argue here is look at the 3 points, because he's saying that science is opposed to religion, secularism should get rid of religion, and then we will have democracy. I think the basis of his argument is problematic, because to start with, science as an approach, there is no such thing as science in the sense like religion, or even religion itself is a problematic definition, but I'm not going to go into this at this level. But there is a perception which he tries to give that science is something whole and concrete and can give answers to everything. But I think that the main strength of science is that it limits itself to specific problems. So we have disciplines, we have biology, and even in biology we have different sections, and in physics. And the scientists work by trying to answer a very specific question, or by putting a certain hypothesis, and this hypothesis has to be give predictive results, and then this will be tested. But if then a scientist, especially, for example, if somebody who's a biologist starts speaking about physics, then he'll probably be out of his depths. But if a biologists start speaking about religion and the universe and everything, and whether there's proof for the existence of God, then he is outside his territory completely. So to argue that science can give you credentials to say, I don't think God exists, or I think that religion is problematic, that's will be a problem. In any case, all science also works with certain assumptions built in. For example, a physicist doesn't question whether the laws of physics are going to continue for the next 2 minutes or the next 100 years. There is no physical way of knowing whether the laws of physics are going to exist or to maintain. Because if indeed we don't believe in anything outside physics, maybe these laws are can work for 2 years or for 3 years. We don't know also if these laws have been existing since eternity. But all physics is built on the assumption that physical laws, so-called physical laws, which are in any case just regularities, have been there for eternity and are going to be there forever or for until the end of time. Now, if you ask a physicist, how do you know this? He has no way of knowing. But some of the assumptions, for example, about the origin of the universe are based on this assumption that laws of physics have always existed. Now, if we go to the other term, which is secularism, Dawkins and his fellow new atheists seem to argue that secularism, especially very strict secularism, which is against all religion and which also should prevent, for example, children from being taught religion, because he, in one of his arguments, that religion is like a virus which catches people when they are young. So we should protect the young people from this virus, and so religious people should not have any say about public matters. Now, to start with, secularism as a principle doesn't have any meaning if there is no religion, because secularism argues that you should have separate form for religion and state or public life. So you have to have religion in order to have secularism. At the same time, most of the modern debate on secularism is based on the modern understanding of religion, because in modern life we have witnessed a long change in the way, for example, people behaved in religious ways. In the past, we had or allegedly in the past, we had a religion controlling everything. Then we had a time when religion became just one system among others. But the very modern definition of religion is based on this change. Religion is, in modern sociological terms, is defined as one area among others. So when you argue, for example, that we are witnessing secularization and we are witnessing a reduction of role of religion, you are already also working with the assumption of the current status of religion and comparing it to the past, when maybe things were not as clear-cut as you mentioned them. But I think more important than this is that when the debate on secularism or the separation of religion and the state started, it actually it was launched by the church, by the Christians, not by the state. And actually, it started here in this city when it was Constantinople in around the 5th century BC, where there was a conflict between the Pope Gelasius I, who was at that time in Rome, and the emperor who was here. And it was at that time that the Pope came up with the theory of the two powers. Because up to that time, and as is usual in all societies, the emperor or the ruler was the person who controlled religion. And he was the one, for example, who appointed bishops and who appointed even the Pope himself. And then at that time, then the church started to argue that no, that's not the case. Christ has two swords or two powers. One sword he gave to the church, and the other sword he gave to the king. So the king or the emperor should not interfere into the issues of the church. So it was actually the church who have initiated this theory of secularism. And for a long time, actually, the state, until the Reformation in England, the state was not actually arguing the other argument, that the state, the religion should be not have influence on the state. The state was arguing, no, the state, the king is the representative of Christ himself. And the king should be the person who is ruling both religion and politics. And this continued until, actually, this struggle continued until modern times, and until the Reformation, and it was actually resolved in favor of the king. In England, until this day, we have the Queen, who is the head of the church. And officially, she is the one who appoints the bishop, and the Archbishop of Canterbury and the leader of the church. And funny enough, he is, of course, because in our system there in the UK, now the Prime Minister actually who appoints the Archbishop. And there was there's a comedy program in Britain called Yes, Prime Minister. And it's a comedy. It shows how, for example, the civil servants sometimes play the politicians and trick them into doing things. And there was one instance where the Prime Minister wanted to appoint a bishop. And the bishop, he has two candidates, and the civil servants wanted his friend to be appointed. So he brought as other candidate a different person, and the Prime Minister looked at that and he said, I think this man should be appointed because he seems to have a good record. And he said, no, Prime Minister, you can't appoint him. And he said, why? He said, he believes in God. And he said, but I thought the whole object. He said, no, the church don't like people who believe in God. They think they are fanatics. And he said, even worse, he's against the Queen. And he said, why is this important? He said, no, everybody in the church regards the Queen as the most important thing in the church. I said, but what about God? And he said, he is what you call an optional extra. So it has evolved in this regard, but the idea is that it is actually the Prime Minister who appoints the bishop. So secularism, like science, is a matter of limitation. It's matter of it's not an alternative ideology. It's a accommodation saying that there is a religion, and in this regard, I think that in countries like Turkey, for example, where secularism is becoming a kind of ideology, might be the true secularism is to separate secularism from the state, because it is now the state religion is secularism. So secularized. Some of you might remember that I wrote an article in very short one in 1997 about my visit to Istanbul. It's called From Istanbul with Love and Fear. And the last sentence in it was, Turkish secularism, ? It would be a very good idea, as Gandhi said about Western civilization. Because there was a famous, if you don't know it, argument. Gandhi was asked once about what do you think about Western civilization? And he said it would be a very good idea. I would say the same about Turkish secularism. It would be a very good idea. Now, if we go to the last term, which is democracy, again here, democracy, of course, we don't want to go into that too long, but I think democracy is usually defined as a political system in which members regard themselves as political equals and as collectively sovereign and possess all the capacities of resources and institutions they need in order to govern themselves. So in such system can only function if people agree not to impose their views on each other. And only so in this regard, it has to be a negotiated kind of arrangement. And in this case, the democracy is also one important aspect of democracy is self-restraint and self-limitation. In democracy, it's not just the idea that the majority can rule. It is the idea that the majority or the state must be limited in dealing with the people. For example, it must be limited by the rights of minorities, by human basic rights of individuals, and by sort of negotiation. So if we look at all these ideas, we see that science, secularism, and democracy have in common in that they have modest objectives and are based on approaches that do not prejudge outcomes. The scientific approach is to explore reality with an open mind, sufficiently limit the area of investigation and accept the challenges of falsifiability. Secularism accepts self-restraint in the area of refusing to impose one particular religious view through the state, but does not oppose voluntary religious observance in society, nor even public enactment of shared values based on religion if the people agree to it. Democracy is based also on the openness and negotiated outcomes and cannot prejudge and preclude particular negotiated outcomes except through similarly pre-agreed principles. So Dawkins and the new atheist argument has achieved this remarkable achievement of turning science into a kind of fanatical creed, which claims to have views about the universe and everything, and to present secularism as a dogma, and to present democracy as an ideology. Now, all this is unacceptable, but I think an important issue here is also the new atheists have also managed to promote Islamophobia in the guise of opposing to religion. By generalizing these prejudices against Islam to other religion, they managed to say, well, we are not against Islam. We are not actually attacking Islam. We are not attacking Muslims. We are attacking religion as such. But if you go to their theses, if you examine them more closely, you'll find that the techniques they are using actually tend to project other religions in a good light, while showing Islam as a kind of fantasy. For example, in his 2006 documentary, which is called The Roots of All Evil, Dawkins goes to Jerusalem, and he shoots footage from there, and you look, when you see, and he mentioned this, that everywhere there are soldiers with weapons. And these soldiers are mainly Israelis. But he didn't mention the soldiers. He says, well, here in Jerusalem is where religions clash. It's where you see the fanaticism at its most, and then he goes to look at Israel, to question Israelis, and the Israelis complain about not being allowed to go into the mosque, the holy mosque in Jerusalem. And this is all the focus here, is that all these Muslim fanatics, they have built their mosque on our land and on our temple, and they're not allowing us in. All right, this is kind of maybe slightly extremist, but not, it doesn't shock you. Actually, it presents the Jews as the aggrieved party. They are the people who are being barred, and they are the people who are being maltreated. And then he goes on to interview a Jewish man who has converted to Islam, who went to live in Gaza and then converted to Islam and became a kind of Hamas guy. And he speaks very fanatically that we don't want these kuffar in the land of Muhammad, and we want to throw them away, and then speaks about women and speaks about everything. And even he's not a representative of the Muslims. He's a new convert, but this is the Muslim voice he finds. And so in this regard, we have the kind of Islamophobia being promoted in a very sophisticated way. And this, I think, leads us to the point about the idea of Europe and where do we stand? Where does Europe or the West? I think that nowadays people speak more about the West as an idea, especially since Huntington Clash of Civilization thesis. Huntington tries to create these identities and say we have here an idea of the West as a civilization. We have Western civilization, and he called it Judeo-Christian, which is again a very interesting thing because the Jews until very recently have been persecuted very fanatically, and even now they are not really accepted as such. I mean, the Jews who are accepted are the ones who are already secular, who are already actually not really Jews in the sense of, they don't say when they go in the public sphere that we are Jews or we are, their Jewishness is not presented. So the very idea that this is a Judeo-Christian civilization and the West is based on it, and then it excludes Islam, has been a manufactured kind of identity. But anyway, at this moment, Europe, as we all know, is a multicultural entity. There has been Jews. There are now quite a large number of Muslims. And until recently, most people have accepted the fact that now Europe is a kind of multicultural society. But of recently, and even before, I think, the 9/11 and 2005 and 7/7 in Britain and so on and so on, there have been an argument that no more. I mean, we don't, these Muslims are not actually European. They are not accepting to integrate into society. And then there has been an attack on multiculturalism itself. That multiculturalism has been a wrong idea. And it's funny enough, for example, the people who say multiculturalism are a wrong idea are the people who never accepted multiculturalism in the first place. Because in France, multiculturalism was never accepted. They were always expected, if you were French, if you want to be French, you have to give up all your other identities and speak the French language, be treated as citizen. Yes, in Britain, by tradition, we had accommodation, usually groups, but the groups who were actually accommodated usually were ethnic groups. Even in Britain, multiculturalism was not based on religion. They might be Bengalis, they will allow them to speak their language, have their schools, Arabs, Pakistanis. So there was not actually this idea of Islam as a component of Western European identity. But nowadays, the Islamic identity has been imposed on people. People say, well, you are a Muslim. Even if you say, I'm a Punjabi, I am so and so, they say, no, you are a Muslim. And then when they say you're a Muslim, you say you're a Muslim, but you refuse to integrate. So, and this is, of course, against democracy itself, because you cannot impose culture on people in a democracy. It just doesn't work. So I think there is a crisis at the moment in the West in particular, and Europe in particular. And the crisis is, as I mentioned the other day, they say it's a crisis of Muslims who refuse to integrate. But I say it's a crisis of Western elites who refuse to recognize the reality that we live in a multicultural world. It's not that, for example, if you do what that Norwegian man tried to do and say you have to expel all Muslims from Europe and have a kind of Muslim-free Europe. Even if you do this, then as Europe, you have to deal with Turkey, you have to deal with the Middle East, you have to deal with Asia, and you have to deal with Africa. And they are actually as many, for example, I think even many more British people living in Dubai than there are people from the Emirates living in Britain. So if you say, okay, let's have a clean slate, so you have to also accept that the British people will be expelled from Dubai and from other areas. And then what are you going to do? I think they need to look now and examine the way that the fanatics are now driving policies in Europe. I think I'll stop here and let Hassan.
Thank you very much. My voice comes. First of all, I would like to welcome again Professor El-Affendi. He's an old friend. I will tell the story a little bit because that was not in his own introduction. When I was in Malaysia attending the Islamic University there, I saw a book in the library with the title of Hunis and Islamic State. Then I thought, and I read the book, and I liked it very much. I thought this should be translated into Turkish because it offers some ideas that we really need in the debates on Islamism in Turkey, and which I translated the first edition, and now the second edition is also available in Turkish. And then a newspaper in Turkey, I will not tell the name of that newspaper, was asking major politicians in Turkey which book they were reading at that time. The question was asked. And then the mayor of Istanbul, currently the prime minister of Turkey, answered this as, I am reading now Hunis and Islamic State, which the translation is Nasıl bir Devlet, and that was published and in the newspaper. And it became a big, hot seller selling book. But major lines or thinking from that book is also in the presentation, I would say, in terms of the debate on secularism. I think that, if I'm not wrong, the book has influenced the mindset of Turkish politicians, if not one particular Turkish politician, and it contributed to the evolution of Turkish Islamism greatly. And this is important because we often think in Turkey that we have evolved in terms of our own transformation of Turkish Islamic identity independently of the Arab world, which is actually not true because many of the thinkers from the Arab world have come forth with ideas of transformation much earlier. In this group, we can also include the name of Rashid Ghannouchi, his idea of combination of Islam and democracy, and I will also include the name of El-Affendi in this group. El-Affendi, of course, was also known. While I was walking in the corridor, I met some Turkish intellectuals, and he said, there is a talk, and they said, we have some meetings, but convey our regards, which I will do later. But they know the name of El-Affendi not from those books, but from his writings for the Inquiry magazine. Inquiry was a very famous magazine in the early 1990s, I would say, right? So, which which I later read. The old copies, unfortunately, that discontinued, just like all good magazines. We really need that sort of magazine today. In this presentation, El-Affendi offers a poignant, a strong criticism of what is known as the group of new atheists. These are basically four prominent figures in the group, including Hitchens, Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and Sam Harris, and possibly others. And they offer a strong criticism or a blatant attack on religion. But I would say that El-Affendi also does in the paper briefly, but he's more polite than I would appear here, that this new atheism is not only an attack on religion, but more precisely, more specifically, it is an attack on Islam. It is cloaked under the name of atheism, which we clearly understand from their position on Israeli-Palestinian issue, for example. There is an ongoing conflict. Even if you don't want to take sides in this conflict, we all know that which group is influenced by religion. What brought them to that part, or the cause of the conflict is very much a religious conflict. So if you are a pure atheist, why do you support one group over the other? Blame the other as suffering from a religious dogma in their self-defense for their political rights, and the other as rational, as modern as possible. A reflection of this discourse was clearly evident, or still, I think, visible in the New York metro stations. A new poster, basically asking Americans a question that, which side to choose. And two sides are offered. One side is the side of rationality, civilization, and the other side is the side of barbarism. And Americans are invited to think that they are a civilized nation, therefore they should, support the side of civilization. So we should not be misled, thinking that this group is only criticizing religion per se, but it is a new form of Islamophobic attacks on Islam. And my surprise is that these figures are actually coming from the Anglo-Saxon world, as El-Affendi also said in his presentation, that we are actually familiar with this doctrine or this kind of ideas coming from the French world, but not necessarily from the Anglo-Saxon world. But these figures are Anglo-Saxon figures, American or British, and they are now saying the same thing as the French used to say for the last several hundred years. So therefore, I think this shows the extent to which Islamophobia in the West has evolved to. So we are hearing the same kind of anti-Islamic discourse coming from the Anglo-Saxon world, cloaked under the banner of atheism, but precisely what the French were saying us, and then, of course, influenced us in Turkey, which many of the writings of El-Affendi is about Turkey, are about Turks, so Turkish secularism. Basically, the paper is specifically about Dawkins and his three-stage attacks on religion. You can either consider it as three pillars of his thesis, or as a cyclic approach, which I understood that way. The science, only an atheist science can develop secularism, and only secularism can develop democracy. This cyclic approach has its own problems, of course. I think it's a myth, and then the paper, I think, should be more, less polite on this point, referring that in the West as well as in the Muslim world, science really did not develop independent of religion. I mean, there's a myth propagated by the Enlightenment history telling us that Western science developed only when West secularized itself. Actually, major universities in the West, almost all of the major universities, were opened as church universities, later secularized themselves, but still this linkage is very strong. Of course, what drives people to contribute, there's also one major area of research in political science, cannot be separated from religion. I mean, only religious motivations really compel people to contribute money to educational causes. Not only, but strongly, more strongly so. And this is also the case in the West, or historically the case in the West. Many of the universities, including the ones I served as professor, were established originally as church schools, and this linkage is still very true. And of course, I mean, this atheism's discourse here is that science requires logic and falsifiable ideas. But even then, as I was listening to the NPR program and the president of the National Geographic Society was talking, the presentation of, for example, Darwinism, it is a theory, but if you listen closely to their presentation of Darwinism, evolution theory, they don't present it as a falsifiable theory, but as a religious dogma. You cannot really question this in Western schools, otherwise you would be labeled as a religious fanatic, So therefore, falsifiability needs to be questioned even for rationally appearing scholars. On the other side, El-Affendi correctly points out that science duty is not to search for answers that religion searches for, such as the Almighty, the God, the notion of God, is not a scientific question. So the questions are different for science and religion, and even religiously inclined scholars in the Muslim world, already understood this in the past, and therefore separated the two realms. But in their separation, they did not really appear as fanatical atheists, and you don't have to do that. The other point is that secularism. I think this is an important debate, because when Turkish Prime Minister, when he spoke in Egypt in favor of secularism, many people in Egypt and in Turkey protested against him. Why do you appear now in favor of secularism? And I think when the municipality invited in 1997 Professor El-Affendi, perhaps that wasn't even available, that kind of understanding. Therefore, you wrote that article that Turkish secularism is a Gandhian idea. I mean, Gandhi's description of the Western civilization is a good idea. But now, in Turkey, many of these same figures that you met at the time in 1997 appear to be strong prominence of secularism. I think in Turkey there is an evolution of the term secularism, and my good friend Ahmet Kuru has a book now from Oxford University Press describing that there are three versions of secularism: the Anglo-Saxon, French, and the Turkish secularisms. Each of them are different, but Turkish secularism, Kemalism, was influenced by the French example. But in both cases, is it really secularism in terms of a neutral separation of religion and the state? Especially the Turkish case is clear that Kemalists are religious figures in their own understanding of society, in their own perception of the society and the basic composition of the society. For example, who was a Turkish citizen, or the majority. In Turkey, the majority, definition of the majority is clearly religious, in the Kemalist understanding. So, and if you take the example of Israel, those who are appearing very secular, they also support the state, an expansion of that state, which was established, or which cannot be separated from religion. So, when people talk about secularism, you need to be distinguishing between those who are advocating a neutral separation of the state and religion, and those who are saying that, but they are not necessarily doing that. I think the Turkish example is you are correct on that is a good idea. But now there are different versions of secularism in Turkey. And I would say here that secularism also needs to be distinguished. Secularism as an ideology needs to be distinguished from the concept which I propose, and I think it's also evident in the literature, secularity. Secularity as the state of being secular. So we are all secular individuals, but secularism as an ideology is another thing. For example, Mohammed Mursi in Egypt, being a university professor, is is U.S. educated professor of natural sciences. Now, is Mohammed Mursi less secular than Mitt Romney in the United States? I would say no, because Mitt Romney believes in a currently living prophet, which receives revelation from God. But Mohammed Mursi's prophet died several hundred years ago, whereas another leader's prophet, and I think that's a very important notion. So in Islam, secularity started right when the prophet has passed away. Because no other leader could claim, especially in the understanding of Sunni Islam, no other leader could claim any kind of contact between him and the God. I mean, Abu Bakr was not a caliph of God, but rather a caliph of Muhammad, representative of Muhammad, rather than any kind of shadow. This concept of shadow is really a Western idea rather than a Muslim idea. Muslims were always historically secular in their understanding, ruled in their understanding, as worldly leaders rather than as shadows of God. But of course, they also later on legitimized themselves. Many of these leaders legitimized themselves as such, and I think Hunis and Islamic State is a book that must be read, to highlight those debates, because it's a very, very important work. Another point I would say is the idea of democracy. Can we have a democracy with the imposition of secularism as new atheism? Maybe before that, I should say El-Affendi's criticism of the new atheist notion of secularism is that new atheism defends secularism not as a neutral separation of religion and the state, but rather as an imposition of atheism on society. This is not secularism. El-Affendi is quite right on this, because if you impose atheism on society under the name of secularism, you are basically imposing a new interpretation of religion. And here in the paper, there are several references to people, such as Chomsky, defining new atheism as another form of religion. And this point should be kept in mind, because the next stage is democracy. And if you impose atheism as secularism, what is left about for democracy? When you impose atheism, you also need to impose several bans. For example, we are in Turkey very familiar with the ban on headscarf that El-Affendi also mentioned. So this ban is not secular ban, because it is not separating religion and state, but rather an imposition of a new interpretation of religion. In Turkey, it is not necessarily interpretation of atheism imposed. When they impose this ban, they are doing not in the name of atheism, but in the name of another interpretation of Islam. It is also quite telling that these figures who defend a headscarf ban feel themselves in need of getting a fatwa. They find their televangelist kind of figures appearing on the TV that headscarf is not really in Islam. Because this need for fatwa is clearly telling that you are actually imposing a new interpretation of Islam or religion. But these figures, these four advocates of the devil, as they are also called, saying this in the name of atheism. And as it is applied in France, also you see this in the name of a ban on a mosque in Britain, in London, because the mosque would be higher than the church of Anglican Church, or larger, or the minaret ban in Switzerland. Are these really bans on in the name of atheism as a neutral separation? These are not neutral neutrally separating people between religion and the state, but these are a new form of religion. And that's, I think, about it. Thank you very much.
I just thank Hassan. I don't disagree with anything he mentioned, so I'm not going to comment. I'd rather have the time for people who want to ask questions.
Maybe he didn't mention, but all questions need to be, need to end with a question mark so we can have more precise, discussion. Okay.
Okay, shall I introduce myself first? My name is Abdelwahab El-Affendi. I'm from Egypt. I'm doing my master's in political science, modern Turkish studies at Şehir University. Well, I have a couple of questions. First, I have to thank you so much for being here with us this day. My first question is about Islam and secularism. It's simply that, can Islam be secularized? And what is about secularism in Islam? I mean, we can imagine a room for secularism in Christianity, for example, and its historical evolution. But in Islam, it's simply, as Dr. Hassan said in his words, secularism just started after the Prophet's death. And even in his life, أنتم أعلم بشؤون دنياكم, you know better than me your mundane affairs. So there is not that comprehensive, all-encompassing secularism of separating values and transcendental issues from our worldly life, but rather separating there are two fields, two distinctive fields. This is one question. Can Islam be secularized in this meaning? And if Islam has been secularized, what is this all about? You understand me? Simply this Islamophobia and this all this war on Islam, it's because they didn't succeed in secularizing Islam, or they think that Islam has not been secularized enough yet. So I just want to just recall Ernest Gellner. He says that Islam is the only religion that Western modernization idea has failed in deconstructing it. Yet what happened is that Islam deconstructed modernization and assimilated the essence of modernity, which is scientific progress, without having to let any of its essence. This is a quote from Ernest Gellner. So the question, so there is two questions: the secularism question, and the other question is about what is this all about if Islam has been secularized already? So why is this happening? The third and last question is that the dilemma of ulama and sultan, the scholars, or the role of the scientists in society and in history, and the authority, the political power. And I want to call here also Foucault. Foucault needs to be revisited when studying and talking about such a topic. He speaks about power and knowledge, and his thesis. And also
excuse me, Abdurrahman, we don't have much time, please.
Okay. Okay, so it's very clear. The question is very clear. And what is the role of scientists today in dealing with these issues from the perspective of power and knowledge? Thank you so much.
Yeah, I think I disagree with Gellner on his thesis, because Gellner starts from the same Orientalist, essentialist characterization of Islam as anti-modern and as a anti-civil society, anti-democracy. I think the issue of secularization is not just a matter of policy. It's also a matter of politics, in the sense that in Britain there is a secular country where the Queen is the head of the church, and this has been a consensus. The consensus has developed on this regard. It wasn't always this way, because Britain was a Catholic country, and in order to make it into an Anglican country, a lot of Catholics were killed or silenced or dispossessed or thrown out. And then they reached this accommodation. In Muslim countries, the accommodation which could be reached differs from country to country. For example, in Saudi Arabia, there was going to be a different consensus about the role of religion in society than in Egypt, than in Sudan, than in other countries, and it is being negotiated. And that's why I said democracy is a form of negotiation. You cannot separate the two from each other, that in every society people negotiate. What is agreed in Islam and every other religion is that you cannot impose religion on people through the state. And I think the problem of modern life may not be religion but the state. That's what I said in my book, that the character of the modern state is this idea of sovereignty, this idea of the state has to control everything. In the past, Hassan may be right that the order was in a sense secular, in the sense, for example, in the Umayyad, not in the early period. In the early period, there was a recognition that the leader of the Muslim community was seen as a religious and a kind of political leader. But since the Umayyad periods, they were accepted as political leaders, but they were not accepted as religious leaders. So there was a kind of secularism in the sense that in the opposite way, which I mentioned earlier about the church, that the people of religion said, no, you are the state, you cannot control religion. We control religion. The ulama said that. And the people sided with the ulama on this. For example, when Al-Mamun tried to impose his doctrine of Khalq al-Quran, or the creation of the Quran, he failed. So the idea that you can use the state to impose religion is incompatible with Islam as such. But the idea that the Muslim community as a community could decide through democratic means, for example, to enact certain laws which derive from Islam, that's their prerogative.
Okay, another question?
Hey, in both of your presentations, both of you mentioned about like how, especially this new atheists demonify not the other religions only, but especially the Islam. But I mean, I'm a Muslim myself, and shouldn't we also criticize ourselves for why these Europeans, the West, bashes the Muslim community that much? I mean, especially about this video on YouTube, like this, making like a showing Muslim community as violent, aggressive people, and and after this video, in Muslim countries there are like who was it? United States ambassador in Libya was killed. I mean, after this video, I mean, there were like really strong uprisals after this video, and for example, when we look at the United States, there are like tons of TV shows or other things that making fun of Jesus Christ, for example. And why can't we just? I mean, we never heard any I'm sure there are some, but we never hear any of those, you know, like any Christian community that is, you know, answering this as violently as Muslim communities. So when we think about this, we really can't just, you know, blame those new atheists about like why they bash the Islam so, that hard, unlike the other, unlike Christianity or Judaism. Shouldn't we also, you know, criticize ourselves instead of just blaming the West for all this Islamophobia and yeah, that's it. Thanks.
I think you are perfectly correct in that. I think I commented on that on many occasions. For example, the fact that this video wouldn't have given all this exposure has it not been for the demonstrations and the acts of the Muslims. And before that, for example, at one point, the Pope said that when he criticized Islam and said Islam is irrational, and then there were also demonstrations, and I commented, I said, well, we seem to be proving the Pope right, that we are acting irrationally. And there is a need for Muslims to, as you rightly said, not to react to everything, and actually it's counterproductive, because it, first of all, it gives this video or this, when we had the book of the Satanic Verses, for example, published in Britain, I think most people didn't hear about the book, and probably would have sold a few thousand copies, because it's such a big book, such a huge novel, and such difficult to read if you try to read it. So dense. And there was a joke after that of people who are saying that the 15-page club, the people who have managed to read 15 pages of Satanic Verses. But once Khomeini made his fatwa that this man should be killed, I was one of the people who rushed to try and get a copy to see what this book is about. And then he sold millions of copies and still keeps selling millions of copies because of our stupidity. And I think that at that time we said also to the Muslims in Britain, you don't need to do all this agitation. You don't need to call for the book to be banned, because first, it's not going to be banned. And secondly, you're giving it publicity, and that I think is quite a valid point. But on this said, the other groups or the Islamophobes or the attackers are not actually, for example, saying to Muslims, as you rightly say, you must be self-critical, you must understand yourself. They are saying things like, for example, that Muslims will never be modern. You will never have democracy, and you will never have this, and not trying to help, but they are trying to also sell another policy. For example, when Bernard Lewis coined the term clash of civilizations, or which was used after that by Huntington, what was in his mind? He wanted to say that the problem between the East, the Muslims and the West, is a problem which is caused by the Muslims. That the Muslims could not get to grips with modernity. They are angry, they are upset, because they were a big civilization and now they are down in the world, and they want to vent their anger on the West. So even if you appease them mainly because everybody at that time, that was 1990, just after the Gulf War, and people were saying that, well, it's time to end the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And to end the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, this means that Israel has to give concessions and to allow the occupied territories back. And he's saying, well, even if they give the occupied territories back, these angry Muslims will still be angry and will still be attacking the West. So don't put pressure on Israel to give concessions, because it's useless, it's pointless. And so it's a self-serving kind of propaganda in order to say, well, it is a problem. But the same I said about Dawkins. When you go to Jerusalem, see all these weapons around, and he says, for example, he makes this remark, he said, there has been, in the last 5 years, 4,000 people have been killed because of religious fanaticism. Now, true, the 4,000 people were killed, but 99% of these 4,000 people were Palestinian, and they were killed by Israeli bombs or guns. And they were not killed because they were religious fanatics. They were killed because the Palestinians have been under occupation. They have been prevented from having their ordinary life. You go to Israel, you know, today, or the Palestine, there's roadblocks everywhere. Pregnant women sometimes get birth at these barriers, and there is completely inhumane treatment. And I think if it was religion which was causing these people to respond like this, maybe religion is a positive thing. If they don't respond to this humiliation, they are not human beings.
We can have one last question, if you have. There's one at the back.
Erdoğan Mısır'a gittiğinde, daha doğrusu birkaç Arap ülkesine, Orta Doğu ülkesine gittiğinde oradaki topluma ve yöneticilere laikliği tavsiye etmişti. Bundan korkmamaları gerektiğini söylemişti. Yani takip ettiniz mi, izlediniz mi bilmiyorum. Ne düşündünüz? Yani Türkiye Başbakanı İslam ülkelerine ve Arap Baharı içerisindeki İslam ülkelerine gidiyor ve laikliği tavsiye ediyor.
I will translate. So, Prime Minister Erdogan recommended secularism to many countries, as I mentioned also, in Egypt, Tunisia, in Libya. I think he didn't do that in Tunisia, but in Egypt and Libya, he spoke in favor of secularism. What do you think about that?
Well, I think I tend to agree with that at this particular juncture because, as I said in the book, which Hassan translated, at the moment we need democracy because we are not in agreement about what Islam means, about what Islamic laws to implement, what are the priorities for what we should do. And we have been deprived from thinking and talking and discussing about these things publicly for a long time. And a lot of people who try to implement Islamic laws without this thinking, without this, like in Sudan, for example, or in Iran or in Afghanistan, they cause more trouble than they have solved because they didn't know what they're getting into, and we don't understand properly what the modern state is, and we need to really disentangle notions and ideas. And so this needs some kind of thinking. So I think in the time being, if we have democracy, that's enough.
I thank Abdelwahab El-Affendi and Hasan Kösev Balaban, and I also thank you for coming here. Thank you. Have a good night.